Today's video, I'm going to be building my cabinets and my little countertop that covers up all of this stuff. So let's get doing that. So first thing, I put some 1/4-inch plywood, attached it to these steel studs just to have something to grab the plywood that I'm going to put on top of this, which is going to be the walnut veneered plywood. And I got to put that up first because it's going to bring out this wall another 3/4 inches, and this tile edging will need to be on this side so I can then fill this strip with the rest of my last bit of tile. And also this wall needs to go on for my cabinets to have something to mount into this way, and it'll also clean and tie everything together when everything sits and butts up to the wall that's already in there instead of butting the wall up to the cabinets. So let's go ahead and scribe this. I'm not going to do it perfectly. It's I can have room for error because the cabinet that I'm going to build is going to come up to about 36 inches. Then I'm going to have a backsplash, and then above that I'm going to have some cabinets. So it doesn't need to be perfect. What matters is just this wall being straight, flat, so I could put the tile on there. So I'm going to measure the highest point and then the widest point, and I'll probably cut the plywood a couple inches wider just in case this wall is any sort of leaning any which way and I just can't see it. But the height, I'm just going to measure the tallest point and then cut the plywood in a big rectangle, and then it's just easier to handle and to manage. So I'll just cut that, and then I'll cut this out, this little notch, so I can slip it in there and then scribe it to my wall. So I got my piece of plywood, extremely heavy, but I got what I want facing outwards in the van facing upwards. So I got it sitting on some foam, and I'm going to cut it on this foam. I marked my line already, and because I'm going against the grain, perpendicular with the grain, it would splinter out if I don't put some tape on it, and it would leave a jagged edge. So I do have a cross-cut sled which is supposed to alleviate that, but I don't have the actual little sled slider thing, so I'm just going to use this as a straight edge and then tape up where the cut will be, and it will leave a nice clean edge. And I figured there was a couple ways I could have cut it. I could have cut it so the long full length of the piece of plywood was a scrap, or the entire top was a piece of scrap. So I figured it was better to have a wider piece at the top than a long thin piece, so I'm going to cut this first. And I also put some tape on the bottom of my saw just to keep the surface of the wood nice so it doesn't scrape up that walnut veneer. And you can see a little bit of tear out that it caused. Some little worse areas than others, but overall not too bad. I'll just have this side facing down, and I might do like a little trim piece at the bottom. But now I'm going to cut it long ways. And because I'm going with the grain on this one, I don't have to worry about putting the tape on there. See that much cleaner edge, no tear out. And I did try to make it as symmetrical as possible, keeping the little spear looking patterns all equal. So this will be my center of my wall. At least I'll try to keep that my center. So for this top edge, I did have to make a template, and I'm going to try to get this pretty accurate. So I just lined it up with that straight edge, marked that, cut that, and then scribed the top. And I'll just transfer this template to the top of my plywood using that straight edge that I cut. It's easiest to use jigsaw for something like this, and it also leaves a pretty decent edge with the right type of blade. See, I think that's a lot better than the circular saw, but it's a lot easier to get a straight line with that than the jigsaw. I mean, that thing is meant for going around curves, and if you even have a straight edge, the blade is so long that it tends to wander, so that's not recommended for doing straight cuts. But for scribing, it works perfect. There we go, that's what that scribe looks like. Not too bad. So, actually lined up with that edge pretty well. This gap, I'm not going to worry about. That'll be covered up. And now I'm going to screw it into all my little pieces of plywood, but I'm not going to screw, I might screw the back side, but I'm not going to screw anywhere in this area. I think I'm just going to put some silicone behind there, and hopefully that'll grab good enough. I just don't want to see any screws attaching that to that. So I got my laser level set up, and I have it locked in to where the pitch is, it's not level, but I can lock the line where I set my measurements to. So I just marked from the floor up to this point 34.5, and with my 1.5 inch top, it will be at 36 inch top. And then on this side, I also marked it at 34.5 from the floor. And I did that with the laser level just so I could get a nice straight line, and I know that line is perfectly straight. So if I had like a normal level and leveled it back, there was just no way to get a measurement accurate from all this stuff to that point being exactly 34.5, or from the ceiling down. So laser level just helps a lot in figuring that out. So now that I have the left side measured and the right side measured, I can go ahead and mark my line all the way across. And I know not everybody has the laser level, so let me show you kind of another way to do it with a normal level. You just got to know where your bubble lies within that space. So it's not completely to the side, but it is just touching that line. So I can then take this level, put it on my mark, and then bring the bubble to where I saw it on the floor, just touching that mark. And as you can see, it lines up with the line that I have. And that's where it was on the floor. So you can just do that, and then the same for left and right, and then follow your lines. So I got one panel done. I cut the width and the height I need, and I had to notch it around my heater down there. It was a little damaged, but that's okay. It's the inside of it. The outside is fine. That's all that's going to be showing from it. But I gotta make room for this bed to lay down so it doesn't interfere with that. So what I think I'm going to do is just cut some 1/4 inch walnut strips that fit down in there. That way I won't have this gap, and I'll just space it and then attach this to that side. So I think I'm going to have to create 2 separate cabinets and then attach them, because the sinks go in here, and this is wider than this shower door, and I don't want the countertop to be flush. I want it to actually be recessed a little bit, probably about 1 inch. So I'm going to make the cabinets 1 inch shorter than where I want my countertop. And then over here, the countertop will be sticking out about 1 inch. So I got to make 2 separate cabinets, so it'll have a little step back and run into my wall over here. So here's my 1/4 inch strip. I just ripped it off of a piece of walnut that I had. And I'll just cut a few of these and then tack them in places just to keep that spacing equal along this cabinet wall. And I put a little mark at the top of the cabinet, so I'll just brad nail this into place. As well as down here along the bench edge. So here I've got my right side, and then my left side had to be shorter due to all those electronics. And then I got my spacer bar, which is some typical 3/4 inch plywood, nothing special. So this will be my bracer bar, and I got a wider one that's over there on the saw for the base. So I'm going to sand these edges and then walnut veneer some edge banding on all these fronts. And that, because I don't have that much space on the bench side, that is actually going to be my fronts. So when you open up a cabinet like this and you have this raw edge, that is what I am going to cover with my walnut veneer. So it'll basically look like that: my bracer bar and my 3/4 inch sides, and that'll be my cabinet. And then I'm going to do a flat panel walnut front as my door. So conventionally, to make a cabinet, you have bracer bars, one at the top, another one in the back and the top, and then another one laying kind of flat to catch your backer board piece that goes in there. And then possibly one also down there at the bottom going across that bottom in the back. And then you have like a toe kick, like a 3/4 inch recess, just to make it look like the cabinet is kind of floating off the ground, similar to that. But my unconventional approach will look a little something like this. So I got my first cabinet, which is small, with a little brace in the front, and then laying on the ground another brace, which only brings it off 3/4 inches off the ground. No toe kick, no recess. And then my short piece right here, and then that 45 going into the second cabinets, which is basically the same thing. And then across the back, the whole length will be the support, the brace for the back of the cabinet. So it's kind of like two separate cabinets that are combined. And that's really the only way this will fit in there, with the main space being opened. And this little piece right here is just a 45 to clean up this transition. Because I want the top to kind of look like that, instead of like that, because this would be hard to accomplish. That little inside corner right there would be hard to sand and hard to cut. It would just be hard to clean that up, where a transition like this would be a lot easier to smooth out and to make look a little bit nicer. And then my sink will go like that. I've got my iron-on edge banding. I lightly sanded my edge, and I did that with all my other pieces. And really all you got to do is get an iron, turn it to the hottest setting, and then just lay down your edge banding and iron it on. And get a really sharp razor blade to cut your veneer. So after I ironed it on, I went as close as possible with the razor blade. See, you want it as flat with the plywood as possible. You don't really want to cut it at an angle like that, because then you'll get rid of that little edge. So I kind of leave it just barely overhanging, so I can then go back and sand it perfectly flush with the rest of the actual face of plywood, so it looks like one piece. And then one last time I went on with the iron and then just ran it across the edge just to make sure all the glue on the edge was very secured. And that's what it looks like after a quick sanding. Nice and flush, kind of makes it look like it's one full piece of walnut. Very nice. Now I'm going to do that to all the others. So the way I'm going to be attaching my braces is with a pocket hole jig, which if you're making your own cabinets, I highly recommend getting a pocket hole jig. What it does is it cuts holes sideways, or drills holes sideways, so you can screw in to the cabinet without seeing any fasteners from the outside. Looks a lot cleaner, pretty simple to use, and it's a very strong joint, especially if you glue it. So that'll be my connection method. And they make different types of little jigs. I got this one, which is a clamp, which is very handy, especially if you're doing drilling a lot of holes. You just put it in there, then clamp it down, and then you got your hole options in the top just to drill through. Makes it easier. See, that's what you're left with. Just some holes for drilling in from your top. So here I'm starting with the bottom, and I'm going to be screwing in from the bottom, so when it flips over you don't see the screw holes on top. But you got to make sure that it is that it's clamped really well, because when you screw in at an angle like that and you're just holding it with your hand, the boards tend to want to follow the screw and kind of lift up. So it's very important to get a tight bond between those two boards and as flat as possible, just so the one doesn't offset the other as you're screwing into it. They do make like 45-degree clamps, but I've never been able to get those to work right. So I'm just using clamps and the screws, and I'm just doing one side at a time. And there's my first cabinet. Now I'm going to have to put this in and then build the rest of it in the van. But this was my first main structural piece. Alright, so I put that in there. I just screwed it in a couple places. See, I have my little 1/4-inch spacer block in there just to hide those. I mean, that one looks like a deep shadow, but there's one in there just so that little crack isn't that visible. And I'm going to eventually screw it to the floor, but I haven't done that yet just because I want to make sure the rest of it fits. And then I'll screw in that back piece to the side that's over here, and that will tie everything in together, and then I will screw it all into the floor. The problem I'm running into now is my wall is not straight, and it would be fine if they had a typical face frame on it, but since it's just the 3/4-inch plywood, it's going to be tricky to sand down at that angle. So what I think I'm going to do is take a board and then cut out that shape, that kind of wedge shape, and then tack it on to the plywood before I put it in, and then put my walnut, the edge banding, and then cut the banding to that triangle shape, if that makes sense. So I think that'll be a good way to hide that gap. So there I got my little tapering triangle piece. We'll see if this works. I've never done anything like this before, but we'll try it out. And I'm just checking before I edge band it. It's 24 7/8 and 24 7/8. Look at that, perfect. Now I got a square or a rectangle, perfect rectangle. So I'm going to go edge band this, and when that is flush against that, it'll look great. So I got to make my bracer bars next, 24 7/8, and then my back piece. I think I'm going to lay it flat and then pocket screw and flat, so I have something to screw into this joist and places on this plywood. But instead of cutting out a big rectangle and then cutting away all that, all I did was cut a strip of plywood and pocket screwed and glued this piece to that. So now I have an extension of this piece, which will then be my backer piece for my countertop. And this is my second cabinet. It's not as dramatic as I thought it was going to be, so I'm not sure if I should put something in there or try to cut the top around that, and I'll figure that out when I get there. But there it is. I put in these bracer bars on this side before I put it in, just so I can clamp from this point to this point, so this is flush. And then when I brought it in here, it was pretty much even with this piece put on there. And then this is nailed to this piece. And now that that's all squared up, I'm going to put on my back piece by measuring from this to the inside of this. So that measurement will be perfectly square to the back. And I ran out of edge banding, so I actually just cut a 1/4 inch or maybe an 1/8 inch piece of walnut just to put on the face of this, and then I flushed it up with the other edge banding, so it's smooth and it looks good on there. I glued it and brad nailed it so you don't see any nails. And there's my frame. It got my back piece in there. It's not pinching that wire. That wire's that's free to move. It's just hanging out back there. So next thing, I think I need one more support right across the middle for my countertop. Just like that. I had some scrap of walnut that was a little too thin for really any other use, so just use that. Now it's very structural. I got points everywhere for my countertop to sit on, and I got a space big enough for my sink, and I got a overmount drop-in sink, so basically I don't need any supports in there, but the countertop will act as its own support. So when I cut out my hole, it'll just drop in there and it'll support itself. And I'm sure I explained why I did this, but if not, I'm just going to re-record it. If you actually look at it, this would stick out past that shower wall 1/8 of an inch. So I had to recess it, and I couldn't make it all this one same length because my water jugs needed to fit in this little cavity. So that's why I have this little bump in. Alright, now we're ready to move on to the countertop. I got some acacia wood butcher block. I think it's going to look pretty cool. It has the same colors as my floor and the walnut, so it'll match pretty well. I am going to make a template out of some 1/4 inch plywood that I have, just to make sure it fits and I get all the little scribes perfect to then go and cut it on the expensive big block of butcher block. And there is the finished product. Nah, I'm just kidding. That's the template. Still template. I just wanted to see if the sink would fit in there. Works pretty good. I think that's a good placement. Scribe looks pretty good. There's a few places that I had to add some notes because I got to add an 1/8 inch there. It's a pretty even gap. And in the back, I got to taper an 1/8 inch to nothing. And all that occurred somehow after I cut everything too short to fix those spaces. But the back doesn't really matter, and this side doesn't really matter if there is a gap. I'll just put a little piece of walnut trim there, and I'm putting in a backsplash that's going to sit on top of the cabinet or on top of the countertop, so that also doesn't matter. And that also might get a little trim piece of walnut, but I'm trying to make that as clean as possible. But so far, there we go. Now it is ready to cut out the butcher block. And this gives you an idea of how open the space still is. So I can easily get in there and work on anything that needs to be worked on or anything that needs to be added to. And then over here, got my little, hopefully my lights don't turn off. They're kind of on there really delicately. But the water tank will fit in there. The second one on this side, and I'll run my pipes to the water, back to the faucet, and I think the little pump back there, and I still have room to pour some diesel into my heater. So everything works out pretty good, and everything is still wide open, even back there with a little spacing. I actually might cut a little hole right there for ventilation purposes, so all this stuff can still get some airflow. Well, thanks for watching. That'll be it. I'm going to end the video there. If you've been watching this far, you're a trooper. But next video, I'm going to finish up the countertop. I'm going to put in my doors, which will be pretty simple. It's just big rectangles. So, if you notice my audio change somewhere in the video, that's because I did have a little microphone that I was using and then somehow it broke. I don't know how. But I did make a little clip of me explaining it breaking, but I felt like the audio difference between the first part of the video and the after part of the later part of the video was just so different that you could really tell when it changed. So I just left it out because I think it brought more obvious attention to it. But hopefully I'll get a better microphone by next video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.